Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me again. Previously we looked at a simple example of a JavaScript promise. We had two functions that performed the same arithmetic to give the same output. However, in one of the functions, this one up here which we called myDelayedSum, we introduced some asynchronous behavior with the setTimeout function. And when we ran the code, we saw that when we logged the output of myDelayedSum to the console here, it ended up giving us an undefined value. And the reason for that is because we tried to log something to the console, an output of a function that hadn't been properly returned yet. So it was undefined. And we handled this problem by using a promise. And the code looked like this. And when we ran the code, we got the output that we had hoped for. So the promise worked for us. And we could handle the problem slightly differently. We could still use a promise, but we could not use, or we won't use the then that we have here, and we'll use async and await instead. So we'll define a function, an asynchronous function. And we'll call it display sum. And we'll bring our function myDelayedSum back. And after we evaluate it, we'll log the result to the console. So what's happening here is we use await to tell the function to stop executing, to not execute this code until we get the result that we need from myDelayedSum, which will take a second, about 1 second to get there. But we're not done yet because we haven't actually written the function myDelayedSum in yet. We have to wrap this promise in our function myDelayedSum. So let's do that. And what we're going to return with this function is this promise right here. Okay, so let's just console or comment this out. Okay, so we're almost there. So all we need to do to see this value or this value here logged to the console is to call this function display sum. And we can do that easily enough. And when we run our code, we get the result we had hoped for. So we've gotten the same result using a slightly different method. We've used async and await instead of then with the promise. And we wrapped our promise inside of our original function. All right, so let's look a little bit more at the nature of asynchronous behavior in JavaScript by defining some new functions. Let's define a function called message1. And let's just have this return a simple message. And that message will be fire1. We'll define another function. We'll call this message2. And I'm sure you can guess what it's going to return. That's right, fire2. we'll define one more function just to make things a little bit tedious. Sorry, we'll call it function message3. And yes, it's going to return the message fire3. Alright, so we can console log all of these. We know what we're going to get. We get fire 1, fire 2, fire 3 in the order that we expected from top to bottom. Now, however, let's introduce some asynchronous behavior into the first function. We'll use setTimeout again. And we'll give it a delay of 1 second. Alright, so now what happens when we run our code? Well, we see that this one, when we try to log the value, the output to the console, it's undefined, as we expected. So we can handle this with a promise, for example. Again, we can define a promise. Again, we can just call it iPromise. Alright, we'll just bring things in that way. And then if you remember, we had to use the then function. Okay, so now we expect that we'll get this message fire1 actually logged to the console instead of undefined. And when we run our code, we don't get it logged to the console. So I made a simple mistake here and I'll have to fix that. And I forgot to use resolve. Remember, when you use promises, you need to use resolve and not return. Okay, so that should get us what we need. Okay, so we did get the value. We did return the value that we needed, fire1, the message fire1. But because there was a 1 second delay, it got returned after messages 2 and 3. So how can we use async and await to make it so that we get the messages fire1, fire2, and fire3 in the proper order, rather than having the message fire1 come last? Right, well, we can do the same thing we did before. We can define an asynchronous function, and we'll call it total message. We'll use await as before. Okay, so we're only going to use await on the function that we need, that has the asynchronous behavior that we need to handle, and that was this one up here. So remember, we don't need the then anymore, and we also need to wrap this promise in a function, and we'll call that function message1. And so we can take it, all of this, put it in here, make sure we return it. Alright. So it looks like we have things set up to return our messages in their proper order. And as before, we need to call the function total message. Cleaning things up a little bit here. All right, let's see what happens. Sorry, as again, today I'm quite scatterbrained. Let me log these to the console. Okay, that should do it. Good, so we get our messages in their proper order. Fire 1, fire 2, sorry, fire 2, and then fire 3. So instead of using promise then, we've wrapped a promise in a function and used async await to help us get the outputs that we desired after having introduced some asynchronous behavior into one of our functions. So I hope that this made not only promises more clear, clearer, but also the async and await functions in JavaScript. I hope it showed you their usefulness. So thanks for joining me as always, and I'll see you next time.